to this webinar today, which is going to be a discussion organized by UNICEF together with the Economic Policy Research Institute and the Government of Uganda. We have, I think, a very exciting presentation today and something that is relevant to many of us in the countries in which we work on the way that investment cases for social protection can be used to as an advocacy tool and as a way to leverage funding for social protection in the countries in which we work. I think the exciting part of today is actually our presentations and the question and answer. So I'll actually just move on at this stage and introduce my colleagues, Diego Angemi, who is the Social Policy Chief in our Uganda Country Office for UNICEF, together with Michael Samson of EPRI to give further information about social protection investment cases. So Diego, I'll actually just hand it straight over to you now. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Pamela, and welcome everyone. It is a pleasure for us to just share some of our experience in generating this investment case for social protection in Uganda. My role today will be limited to providing a little bit of the background and maybe some of the ideology that led to the development of this document. We worked hand in hand with the government of Uganda, with the expanding Social Protection Secretariat in the Ministry of Gender, with the support of the Economic Policy Research Institute. And Michael stands as testimony of the terrific support that EPRI provided in this activity. Maybe just to introduce social protection in Uganda, for those of you who are not familiar with it. No more than about 6 months ago, the government of Uganda approved the National Social Protection Policy, and it's an implementation plan. And it's in the wake of this implementation, of this approval, that we developed an investment case for sustained investments in social protection, essentially to create a more coherent platform to engage with a view to provide different options and different instruments on which government could count on, with a view to support the successful implementation of the National Development Plan and the effective implementation of the National Social Protection Policy. In crafting this document, we decided that 3 pieces would be absolutely essential to tell a full story. The first piece was a rigorous and semi-experimental analysis or assessment of the existing social protection program. The existing social protection program, commonly known as SAGE, originally included a vulnerable household grant and a senior citizens grant. And we were lucky to have nationally representative data from the National Household Surveys of 2010 and 2013 that basically capture the time before and a few years after the beginning of the national program. So the first part of the investment case essentially makes a case for the fruitful and very effective contribution that social protection has had in Uganda in terms of alleviating the burden of vulnerability and poverty on Ugandan households. The second part is a little bit more technical, in that it basically microsimulates the different options that were jointly agreed to from today all the way to 2040, which coincides with Uganda's ambition to become a middle-income country. And the third piece basically looks at the fiscal space available to fund the very interventions that were microsimulated. Now, without going into the details of the analysis, which will be ably explained by Michael, maybe just 1 or 2 words of caution and 1 or 2 lessons learned in this fairly complex process that lasted over a year. The one thing is that we started off on a very consultative platform. And when I say consultative, it stretches far beyond what you might think of, the usual suspects, the partners, the stakeholders who are commonly engaged in social protection. Uganda has had a history of being a rather hostile ground in terms of engaging in social protection dialogue, and to this effect, we went above and beyond anyone's expectations to involve partners such as the Ministry of Finance, the Uganda Revenue Authority, the National Planning Authority, and you name it. From the word go, we discussed with the various partners what their specific interests were in developing such a document. And for instance, we received clear guidance from the Ministry of Finance that they were fully convinced on the social impact story, but they wanted hard evidence that social protection makes a difference in terms of economic growth. And you will hear some of this, some of the results from this analysis from Michael in just a few minutes. The mere presentation of these results, without saying, caught great interest from our colleagues in the Ministry of Finance, who kept engaging in the process of developing this investment case. Now, breaking down the layers, the Ministry of Finance really means everything and nothing. When we engaged with the Ministry of Finance, it wasn't just with one or two individuals who shared an interest in this agenda, but it was with different departments, with different teams that touched on the different key components of the structural makeup of the Ministry of Finance. That means the budget department, that means public administration, that means infrastructure and social service delivery, that means macroeconomics, and as well as at a higher level, the budget department and the economic affairs department. And last but not least, one thing that is extremely important to notice is that this analysis is a very live piece of work. We are already updating the analysis with the revised GDP figures because the economy keeps moving, and and we try to follow this moving target by providing them the best possible credible evidence in order to support this agenda. As you will hear from Michael, the revised analysis already, and we only launched this a couple of months ago, shows that with the new GDP figures, we are looking at the possible cost of scaling up most of the interventions presented in the investment case. Sorry, let me start again. Shows that the revised GDP figures basically indicate that the cost of scaling up the interventions presented in the investment case is significantly lower than the figures that we had already taken into consideration when formulating this document. So, in a nutshell, guiding principles: keep the analysis live, keep the stakeholders engaged, and tap into the very interests of each and every stakeholder that plays a role in this agenda. Having said that, hopefully I won't have stolen any time from the most interesting part of the presentation, which is Michael's presentation of the investment case. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Diego, and thank you, Pamela. And let me thank all of you who are participating in this webinar. It's an honor to have the opportunity to discuss this research. I Googled investment case and social protection this morning because I realized that this is an example of an investment case. And the whole first page of results included work from UNICEF on the methodological issues involved in investment cases and discussion of this investment case for Uganda. So there are not many investment cases that have been built for social protection. But this document and what I'll talk about for the next 40 minutes addresses very specifically the demands of policymakers for evidence. And as Diego pointed out, we consulted with the Ministry of Finance. And it was clear from our very first meeting with them that they are not only concerned with delivering people's rights, and this is what social protection is about, but they are also concerned with the impact on inclusive social development and equitable economic growth. And the good news is that globally, the evidence on social protection and the evidence from all across Africa, and very specifically the evidence from Uganda, is that social protection is an investment. Yes, it delivers people's rights, including children's rights, but it also is an important component of a growth and development strategy. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see an overview of how I will make this case in the next 38 minutes. First, I want to look at evidence of an impact assessment that we carried out for SAGE using government statistics, government household surveys. The results from this assessment are corroborated by an independent assessment that was also conducted for SAGE. And in presenting these results, I want to take a step back and look at the global evidence base that drives our theory of change and how it's embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals. And then I'll say a few words about the key questions we asked and our methodology, and I really want to focus on the impacts. But then in the second part, I want to look forward. Microsimulation is a policy tool, a tool for analyzing, even before we implement programs, the potential impacts, the costs, the efficiency, the value for money from these programs. And I want to look at these results within the context of Uganda's fiscal space, the capacity of Uganda to fund as a key policy priority these critical investments in delivering people's rights and strengthening inclusive social development and equitable economic growth. So if we look at the next slide, we see the basic evidence from around the world on the impact of social protection in achieving sustainable development goals. We'll see that in just a few seconds, that if we map the global evidence base, and I agree this would take hours to go through all of this evidence. We will need to listen to many of the other IPC webinars on social protection to get the details on this evidence. But we see that social protection programs around the world tackle poverty and inequality, helping to achieve goals 1 and 10. They strengthen food security, strengthening goal 2. Very importantly, and I'll talk about this more in just a minute, they improve health, particularly for the youngest children, helping to build cognitive development. This strengthens goals 3 and 9. Most of the persuasive evidence we've seen in almost every instance where social protection's impact has been analyzed, it improves educational outcomes, helping to achieve goal 5. And there are others, including household-level environmental management, very importantly, strengthening social inclusion and cohesion that feed into goals 11 and 16. And as finance ministries all around the world ask us, there's compelling evidence that social protection fosters inclusive economic growth, promotes decent work, and yes, raises labor productivity. These are helping to achieve Goal 8. They improve macroeconomic resilience, strengthening Goal 12, and just look around you and see who's involved in social protection programs around the world. They but 3 of the world's leading over the past several months have weighed in on global economic policy with a critical theme that, and look at the next slide here, investing in children is the most productive pathway to long-term economic prosperity. I'll just flip through these 3 really quickly as further reinforcement for this key theory of change. The next slide shows us from the National Academy of Medicine a study that conclusively finds that investing in children globally is a primary means of achieving sustainable human, social, and economic development. This slide might flash past you as I get to the next slide, but we'll go to the second of those slides from the Lancet, where a comprehensive study taking the whole volume of this edition of the Lancet documented how early childhood interventions effectively supported by social protection yield long-term benefits, boosting workplace productivity and increasing income and reducing inequities. This we see on the slide in front of us. One of the things that has struck me every time I visit Uganda is how the private sector foundation has made one of its core priorities investment in early childhood development, broadly defined, including the kinds of benefits that social protection delivers. I have not found many countries in Africa where the private sector is so forward-looking and so understanding of the importance of this investment. And the final slide is something particularly relevant for Uganda, a study published in the British medical journal Global Health, focusing on Asia and how Asia can maintain its miracle growth rates, but with a lesson critically important for a country as young as Uganda. And that lesson is that and this is the next slide, British Medical Journal, child-sensitive social protection with its prenatal and early childhood investments nurtures in children cognitive capital. It not only delivers human rights, it lays the foundation for inclusive social development and equitable economic growth. Now, I'll go to the slide after the British Medical Journal slide. It's a diagram that shows social protection as a life cycle framework, a framework that requires a range of interventions from investments for pregnant women, for babies, in early childhood, in adolescence, in adulthood, and for older people. Social protection is not a single cash transfer or a single program. It starts at the beginning of the life cycle, supporting pregnant women to have healthy children. It enables these children to have a happy childhood, to meet their basic needs, and to build the capacities that enable them to achieve their potential, to grow into adults who can contribute to Uganda's social economic life, to the economic and social life of all the countries where people are benefiting from social protection. It protects people from vulnerabilities, it promotes people's access to opportunities, it delivers people's rights, it ensures security in people's old age. And this focus, I'll go past this to the final diagram on the theory of change, that purple diagram that shows in a nutshell the evidence of social protection's investment impact, starting first and foremost in terms of reducing poverty and tackling vulnerability. So we go 2 more slides from there. We'll see multidimensional impacts of social protection. That's what social protection does. Its first and foremost aim is to tackle poverty and vulnerability. But it also builds human capital, which today is the foundation of the wealth of nations. It enables workers in these households to better achieve more sustaining livelihoods. First, by helping these households manage the kinds of risks and shocks they face, but also by providing the goods and services that enable them to better supply themselves to labor markets and engage in more sustaining livelihoods. And social protection supports macroeconomic impacts. It makes whole nations more resilient. It builds social cohesion. It can facilitate the kinds of pro-poor reforms that can better enable economic growth. Now, the next slide points this analysis to Uganda, and it summarizes some of the previous evidence that has been so convincingly cited in support of the investment case. A study just a couple years ago by the world-renowned Massachusetts Institute of Technology looked at global social protection programs, and it found no negative impact on labor markets. This is important because when we talk to finance ministries, when we talk to so many policymakers, the number one worry they express is that social protection might create dependency, that for some reason giving poor and vulnerable households a small cash transfer might make them lazy. This groundbreaking study by MIT corroborates repeated studies by the Economic Policy Research Institute, by the Overseas Development Institute, studies funded by the UK government, studies by the Transfer Project, a project of UNICEF and FAO, independent researchers, literally hundreds of studies that demonstrate social protection is supportive of labor market engagement and inclusive economic growth. Here in Uganda, a gold standard randomized controlled trial in northern Uganda tested a cash transfer and a training and mentoring package for women who had never run a business before. We saw a significant increase in a labor supply by the participants in the program. We saw a doubling of new non-farm enterprises and significant rises in the income of the participating women. This study by MIT also cited another evaluation of Uganda's Youth Opportunities Program. Here, a grant of $7,500 to youth groups. This is about $382 per member. After 4 years, the results were a 50% increase in productive assets, a 30% increase in earnings, and a 17% increase in hours worked. The next slide will give the kinds of questions we're asking, reflecting on this global evidence, as we look at Uganda's flagship social protection program, the SAGE program. We are focused on 4 key questions here. First of all, is nutrition as the key driver of cognitive capital today the foundation of Uganda's future prosperity? Is social protection improving nutritional outcomes? The second, because education is the key input that builds on this cognitive capital to put it into productive use, do we see improvements from SAGE in education?
Hi everyone, sorry, I'm sure you've noticed, we seem to be having some connection problems, so we're just trying to get Michael back online now. Maybe while we're waiting for him, I don't know if anyone has any initial questions where you just want to share with me now, and I start writing them down, or please share with chat to our organizers, and they'll pass them on. But yeah, it should just be a moment more. So sorry for the delay and the technical problems. Thank you. It looks like we nearly have him back. So again, sorry for the slight delay. Yeah, sorry, it'll be just a moment more. Maybe I'll invite Diego back for just a moment to maybe provide a little bit more on the context and the discussions that we're having in Uganda while we wait for Michael to reconnect.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll pick up where Michael sort of left off. and try and maybe rationalize some of the indicators that were chosen for the evaluation of the SAGE program. And maybe I'll give a little bit of background as to the kind of instruments that were chosen to develop this document. In terms of indicators, there was a, as I mentioned in my introduction, we had to strike a balance between what colleagues in the Ministry of Finance referred to as business as usual, and that applies to the socially oriented indicator like nutrition and education, and the more economically sort of shaped indicators, and that goes for employment and labor productivity. Some of the things that the data was, we were bounded by sort of data limitations because we didn't set off to evaluate the program as the program sort of began. We sort of set out to evaluate the program given available data that was nationally representative and, most importantly, representative of the geographical areas and districts where the program is being implemented.
Okay, I think I'm ready to start again. Sorry about the technical difficulties.
Oh, excellent.
But I think I'm back on my original computer. I'll do the rest without the video. Perhaps the video was creating some problems, but we will. We're looking at the key questions, and the next slide. Diego, where did you lose me, on the key questions or on the methodology?
So we lost you around the key questions, and then I gave a little bit of a background in your absence as to the balance we arrived at between the social indicators and economic indicators of the evaluation. So you're right. You can pick up right where you left off.
Great. I'll pick up right there with the implementation. Here we see a table of the 15 districts for which we analyzed these key indicators. We can see that the start date and the date the last sub-district was reached in these 15 districts are bookended by two surveys, one from 2009 and the other from 2013. If we go to the next slide, I just summarize the key methodology. We're using these government surveys, the 2009 survey, to get a baseline. What did these districts look like in terms of these indicators before SAGE was implemented? And then 2013 tells us the impact after the SAGE implementation. And we constructed district-level indicators not only for these 15 districts, but using a matching approach to identify comparable districts where SAGE had not been implemented. And we used gold standard evaluation approaches, difference and difference estimators, to assess the impacts. And so what we see, for example, on the next slide is the substantial improvement in the reduction of food insecurity, the reduction in the number of households eating fewer than 2 meals per day. That was an 11.5% improvement in this indicator. The next slide shows how this improvement in food security contributed to an improvement in key nutrition indicators, particularly the short-term indicator weight for height. While in the non-SAGE districts, this indicator was worsening. It was slightly improving for nearly a full standard deviation positive impact attributable to SAGE. And the next slide shows us the results on school attendance, that we see a 14 percentage point improvement in primary and secondary school attendance in SAGE districts compared to comparable non-SAGE districts. And the final slide that I'll talk about in terms of the impact assessment regards the improvement in employment. We saw employment increasing over this time period all across Uganda, but more rapidly in those districts that benefited from SAGE. Now, there are a number of factors going on here. One, the direct effect of SAGE is to enable households to better manage their livelihoods risks. They're better able to engage in labor markets, to look for work, to find work successfully, to invest in their enterprises. But also the income effect of SAGE on the whole district boosted local economy multipliers. And so there were indirect effects on non-SAGE households in these districts as well. All of these results that I'm reporting here from our matching study have been corroborated by a second and independent impact assessment commissioned by the government of Uganda. Now, I just want to go back to go to the next slide and go back to some of the results from before we began this matching exercise to give you an idea of how this analysis was done. It shows on the left-hand side of the slide the 15 SAGE districts, what we in evaluation terms call the treatment group. And then on the right-hand side of the next slide, the one that says alternative tests show the same results, we see 15 districts that have similar characteristics before SAGE was implemented. And when we compare those two slides, we can see that the key employment rate indicator in both these slides are virtually the same. Okay. And then the second slide, the one with the red and blue bars that says alternative tests show the same results, show you how employment changed after SAGE was implemented in the districts on the left-hand side of the slide. You can see by comparing those slides, and I don't know if you can see it. I can't see it on my slide. I'm looking at the slide that says alternative tests show, and I'm getting more error messages here. Okay, great. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can. There was a slight delay, it looks like, in the slides, but it seems like we're catching up.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Okay, I am getting error messages on my screen, and I'm hoping the software is still cooperating. Okay, right. This is exactly the slide I am referring to. You can see that the pattern of the blue bars on the left and right hand comparisons are virtually the same patterns. Those are the patterns before SAGE was implemented. And then the red bars are what happened in both sets of districts after SAGE was implemented. And we can see that employment is growing much faster in the SAGE districts than in the comparison districts. If we go to the next slide, we'll see these numbers more directly. We can see that in SAGE districts and in matched districts, those two blue bars are virtually the same. That's the average employment rate in the SAGE and matched districts before SAGE was implemented. These are the poorest districts in Uganda, and the low employment rates represented by those blue bars represent that poverty. But we can also see after SAGE was implemented, the impact in those red bars, we can see the substantial increase in employment comparing the SAGE districts to the non-SAGE districts. And the next slide reflects something from the SAGE website, qualitative work that the government has carried out that helps us understand why these kinds of effects happen. SAGE, yes, it was only providing 25,000 Uganda shillings, about $9 US per month. But it provided poor people in vulnerable households with the security and just those additional resources that enabled them to meet their most basic needs and gave them the security to invest. In the case of Joyce, investing in livestock. And this came about through developmental interventions, including savings groups that helped her turn these resources into more sustaining livelihoods. So the next slide summarizes the key investment results. SAGE contributes to food security, to nutrition, to education, to the building blocks of long-term cognitive capital that is today the foundation of the wealth of nations. It also helps in the short term, immediately improving households' abilities to manage risk with employment and labor productivity impacts. More broadly, SAGE is strengthening Uganda's achievement of inclusive social development and equitable economic growth. Now, the second part is going to be shorter. I'm going to present some of the results looking forward of policy proposals identified by the government of Uganda through the Studies Steering Committee. And there were three main areas, as we see in the next slide, national priority areas. One, the national rollout of a senior citizens grant and a disability grant. Second, a focus on child and maternal health, universal health care for pregnant and lactating women and children under 5 years of age. And in the third, support for education and childhood well-being through a child support grant. Now, the next slide, the one that says fiscal space and social protection, provides the inspiration for our fiscal space analysis. Just a couple years ago, the Minister of Finance made it clear that the main thrust of tax policy is to progressively enhance revenue mobilization, domestic resources to enable the government to finance its budget. And the finance minister stated the priority of raising the tax to GDP ratio, the main way we measure tax effort, by 0.5 percentage point to achieve 16% by 2018. And the fiscal space analysis asks the question, what if 10% or 20% or even 30% of this additional revenue were allocated to funding the investment in inclusive social development and equitable economic growth that social protection represents? Now, the next slide that says model assumptions just outlines the key underpinnings of our analysis. A real 6% GDP growth rate, an inflation rate based on IMF projections of 6.92%, that benefit levels and administrative costs are growing, that we calculate nominal GDP by applying this inflation projection to the real GDP estimates. And we took as our base in this revised analysis 2013 and GDP at market prices from the World Bank's World Development Indicators database. And we can see from the next slide, the senior citizens grant would benefit over 1 million individuals. It would have a significant impact reducing both the poverty gap and the poverty headcount. And the next slide shows the cost of this benchmarked against the 10%, 20%, and 30% estimates. We can see that a national rollout of the Senior Citizens Grant would barely require more than 10% of the additional revenue the government aims to mobilize. But it would peak around 2022 at just about 0.5% of GDP. And then the cost would fall over time after that as a share of national income as the economy grew faster than the population was aging. The next slide looks at investing in universal health care for pregnant women, lactating mothers, and children under 5. And we looked at a number of different alternatives, under 2, under 5, under 8. And if we look at this next slide, we see that benefiting 2.7 million women, 7.6 million children would provide a total cost of 1.3 trillion Uganda shillings, but the value of lives saved through this investment, if we were to quantify that using economist approaches, would be more than 60% greater than that at 2.1 trillion. And if we look at the next slide, we see the fiscal space required to finance this. Yes, that rises steeply in the first 10 years. It would absorb pretty fully 30% and a little more of the government's projected additional revenue collection. But again, by 2022, as demographic changes lead to a falling ratio of children in the population, and as the economy grows, the cost of this will fall, so that by 2040, it's less than 1% of national income. We also looked, as the next slide shows, at a number of scenarios for the disability grant with a low benefit and a high benefit level. The slide that says disability grant low benefit level compares the number of beneficiaries from different targeting approaches. We can see that we can significantly reduce the poverty gap even with a universal program, reaching everybody with disabilities. And a poverty-targeted program has a smaller effect, but a slightly higher efficiency. And we can see from the next slide that shows the fiscal space envelopes for these 3 scenarios, that they are all affordable within the fiscal space envelope we've been analyzing. And some of the scenarios requiring less than 10% of the government's projected additional revenue. The last intervention I want to look at is the child support grant. Again, we looked at multiple scenarios. We looked at a universal program, one targeted to vulnerable households, and one more narrowly targeted to poor households. We looked at low benefit levels and high benefit levels. The slide that says the child support grant under 2, the low benefit level, shows that reaching every child under the age of 2 would benefit 2.2 million children. It would reduce the country's poverty gap by 25%. A more targeted program would have a lower impact, but again, a recurrent theme, a slightly higher efficiency in reducing poverty. The high benefit level generates greater impacts with a slightly lower efficiency. And if we look at the slide that says fiscal space and social protection, we see that all of these scenarios, including the universal grant, are easily afforded within the fiscal envelopes we've analyzed. Even the universal program is less than 30% of the additional fiscal space that the government will be creating over the next few years. And the more targeted programs, just a fraction of 1% of GDP, and well below even the most limited expansion in fiscal space, the 10% increase. The next slide puts some of these together and looks at combinations, and we can see that combinations of the Senior Citizens Grant and the Child Support Grant can be affordable today. Yes, they would exceed in the initial years this 30% projection, but by 2023, they would be well within this envelope of fiscal space, and after that, as the economy grows faster than the demands of social protection increase, they would become increasingly affordable. So with that, let me conclude and turn this back to the moderator. I think we see two key results here. The first is that a progressive expansion of social protection in Uganda that includes vital instruments like a senior citizens grant rollout and disability grants and health care for mothers and for young children and child support grants. These are clearly affordable for the government and the people of Uganda. And second, these vital interventions will not only deliver human rights in Uganda more effectively, they will also contribute importantly to inclusive social development and equitable economic growth. They can drive Uganda's transition to a prosperous nation. Thank you.
Michael, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I imagine that we're going to have a lot of questions coming in over the next half hour, but if I could just start with a couple of questions for clarification that came in from our colleague Paul Stevenson at World Vision. He was wondering if you could clarify how you chose the definition of social protection and how broad it was, what it encompassed when you were doing this analysis. Because it seems to incorporate some of the transfer programs and also the health initiatives. How did you decide on this, on what to include in social protection here? Sorry, I think you might be on mute.
Thank you. Yes, I forgot to unmute. Thank you, Pamela. This is a really important question. As we were thinking about the definition of social protection, we actually used two different ones operationally. The first was for the broad impact assessment, looking at the global theory of change. And this is a very encompassing definition that reflects global evidence on tackling poverty and vulnerability. And so it reflects our work in over 40 countries around the world. It reflects our consultations with these governments and with international organizations like UNICEF and other UN agencies and other development partners. And it reflects on the global evidence of impact. So we're looking at social protection interventions that provide benefits to tackle poverty and vulnerability, that prevent a further decline into poverty, that help promote livelihoods and help transform societies. The transformative approach is informing this within a life cycle framework. That was very encompassing. But when we looked at the microsimulation and the ex-ante policy analysis, we listened to the government of Uganda through the steering committee for this project, and very specifically took direction from the steering committee and from the government of Uganda on what Uganda's core priorities are.
Thank you for that. Actually, just building on that a bit, but also getting into what you were speaking of about the advocacy story, which was very interesting here. We found often, I think, that despite, as you noted, there are these hundreds of research reports showing that the link between social protection and dependency, or alcohol and expenditures on alcohol, tobacco, fertility, that these are kind of false linkages. That narrative still seems to resonate a lot with governments in the countries in which we work. I wonder if you can talk about how you found it possible to use research like this investment case, to use the data to overcome these kind of narratives that seem to have stuck despite the evidence.
This, I think, is the billion-shilling question. All around the world, in spite of the evidence, there is this ideological gut response to the idea, particularly of cash transfers. I think it stems from a number of sources. One, yes, in some of the richest countries of the world, where cash transfer programs have been 100 times more generous and often poorly targeted, so they created perverse incentives to stay poor. Poverty targeting can be a curse. It can undermine developmental impacts. And in some countries, some of the richest countries of the world, poverty targeting was the norm. And I think it did create perverse incentives and some dependency. But in almost every developing country, the benefits are so much smaller that even when poverty targeted, they generate very little negative impacts and overwhelming positive impacts empowering households. So this evidence is helping to refute, one, some of the irrelevant evidence from rich countries, but also, I think, an ideological aversion to giving people something without demanding something in return. I think that's at the root of this ideological aversion. What this evidence shows is that you're not giving people something when you provide a social protection benefit. More importantly, you are enabling them, you are empowering them to better realize their potential. You are, as the title of this webinar says, you are investing in your country's future prosperity. And yes, this evidence goes part of the way there. But where I have seen policymakers really change their mind is when they get out into the field and they visit the households that are participating in these programs, and they see the transformative impact on people's lives. Then policymakers realize what kind of positive impact this has, not only in delivering people's rights, but in transforming their nation.
Yeah, that's a great response. It's really interesting, and I think it's a study that we all, or a question we all face. So I appreciate that. I'm going to just switch back to a couple of clarifying questions for just a moment. I'm wondering if you could clarify whether the study also looked at contributory social security and whether the government is also involved in that.
We didn't focus on the contributory programs. Social protection is a broad set of interventions that include social assistance, but also social security and other legislative programs that help deliver people's rights. We focused very specifically on the core priorities, the most immediate instruments that can tackle poverty and vulnerability, taking direction from the steering committee. And I think this was very good direction, focusing on the instruments that I described in the second part of my presentation. That does not mean that these contributory programs are not important. They are, but they're really something that would require some further analysis.
Okay, thank you very much. And we had another question coming in from one of our colleagues that was more on if we go back to your last few slides where you're showing the different benefit levels, if you could just give us a sense of how those compare to the average income and the poverty level in Uganda.
So I could go, so when the last two slides are the set of interventions that we're looking at. Fiscal, so we'll look at the child support grant and the senior citizens grant, and we're looking at the disability grant. One of the things we've done as we've worked through these numbers is we've benchmarked them to per capita income in the country. And I'm going to need to go to this matrix here that we've been working on to give you a sense as to the relative size of these benefits. I have that right here. As a percentage of per capita income, the disability grant is about 10% of that. And that's the low level. And the high level, about 15% of per capita income. And the child grant, the low level is a little bit lower than the disability grant at about 9% of per capita income, and the high level is 13% of per capita income. And the senior citizens grant is about 14% of per capita income. Now, poverty lines vary, so depending on where the poverty line is relative to per capita income, these benefits are a significantly higher percentage of the poverty line.
Great, thank you very much. We have a question coming in about, sorry, I think there was a little bit of a break off there, but we have a question coming in that about the interesting data on the impacts of the social protection programming on malnutrition, which is something that it's often difficult to find in social protection programs, to find these impacts. Do you have any theories on the reason for this impact in Uganda?
Yes. You are correct in saying that we often do not find nutrition impacts in these studies, in part because nutrition is a very complex outcome. Getting an increase in school attendance or an improvement in food security is relatively easy. Getting an improvement in nutrition is often much more complicated and involves interacting a range of different interventions, including improvements in maternal care, improvements in water and sanitation, along with the food security that a cash transfer provides. Now, if we go to that slide on the nutrition impact, we see something that we don't see in many studies, and that is there's a fairly gentle improvement in the SAGE districts, but a fairly significant decline in the non-SAGE districts. And what we hypothesize is that SAGE was more preventive in this particular context, that districts were being hit by global economic shocks and by other shocks, so that unprotected districts saw one of the key ingredients in protecting children's nutrition compromised. There was an income shock in these districts, and it led to a worsening in these nutrition outcomes. Whereas in the SAGE districts, all the other ingredients for nutrition were already in place. And what SAGE did was protect these households from the income shock that was compromising nutrition outcomes in the other districts. In the absence of these shocks, I am not sure that we would see the same positive impact on nutrition that we see here. Normally, we need to see integrated interventions to effectively improve nutrition outcomes. But because here there were shocks affecting these districts, SAGE could essentially harvest the lower hanging fruit, preventing the deterioration of nutrition outcomes and actually improving them to a slight extent.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting. We are getting so many questions, which I think is a really great sign. I'm just trying to figure out what to pull up next, but I think maybe I'll start a bit by getting into some of the practical questions that we've gotten in by a couple of our audience members. And maybe you can start really quickly by discussing how this research worked together with the other studies that you had mentioned were ongoing at the time, and how, or whether you think the kind of multiple bits of research that were ongoing in Uganda and have shown these similar results, if that would help to address some of the concerns that have come up in the past about external validity issues.
Sure. One study that was conducted by the government of Uganda focused on a relatively small sample of households where what we call external validity, how can we generalize these results to the entire population, might be called into question. But it used a distinct set of analytical techniques, different matching approaches. It started with an entirely different methodological approach, but using very purposive data at a household level for SAGE beneficiaries. On its own, I think that study would struggle to find resonance with policymakers for a lot of reasons I won't go into right now. But because it's a very well done study, because it was commissioned by government, because it was specifically focused on evaluating SAGE, it answered a lot of important questions. This study is different. It uses national surveys. It has a much larger sample. It's using a very different micro unit for analysis and a different methodological approach. But it's coming up with virtually the same results as the other study. This is what we call triangulation. We don't have perfect data in either instance, but the fact that we take two very different approaches, we ask very similar questions, we come up with reinforcing results. This sends a much more credible and convincing message to policymakers. And there are other studies that are ongoing. I think they will help answer the questions policymakers are asking. In these cases, I think it's critically important that the questions we're addressing are the questions policymakers are asking. And so we're taking direction in terms of the key questions from the policymakers who need this evidence. And I think all of that helps contribute to an improvement in evidence-informed policy development.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really important point, and about the sort of balance between the normative and rights-based arguments that we usually make to advocate for social protection versus some of the more economic growth and inequality questions that governments might have a strong interest in. And thank you for that. I'm wondering, we have a question, another kind of practical question from one of the audience on if we need panel data to do the micro simulations, or if there are other means to do this in contexts where that might not be the case.
No, we do not need panel data for micro simulation. We often need panel data for impact assessment, but most micro simulation models are built from simple cross sections. And then that simple cross section is modeled dynamically based on demographic models and economic models that enable us to take that cross section and age it to the current time period, to 2017, and then to age it forward, reflecting the demographic change that our demographic models are projecting for Uganda. And at the same time, we model the economic assumptions that enable us to grow the cross-section to reflect the economy of 2017 and the economy of 2030. So there are dynamic microsimulation models that use panel data, but most of the investment cases in developing countries around the world, the overwhelming majority of those in Africa, have simply used cross-sectional data for the ex-ante policy analysis, just as this one has.
Okay, great. I realize we're getting a little bit late on time, so I wanted to switch maybe to some of the questions that we're getting on sort of the what's next. We have quite a few questions coming in where people are wondering if we can talk about some follow-ups to the advocacy and maybe how you differentiate the advocacy that you're doing with ministries of finance, for example, versus others that might be more likely to support expansion of programs and to be convinced by the welfare arguments.
That's a really important question. Yes, sometimes we are in a very fortunate position to make a rights-based case and to see governments willing to implement good policies simply because they're the right thing to do. South Africa, for a decade, was driven by a visionary leadership in the Department of Social Development that saw the delivering of rights as the primary driver of the expansion of the social protection system. But even the best policymakers who have the greatest commitment to championing social protection, they end up in the ring with an opponent. And that opponent is not necessarily supporting or influenced much by these rights-based arguments. And so we have to empower these champions with the economic arguments so that even if they can't persuade the opponent, they can just, finance ministers are often the smartest politicians in the country. They know how to pick their battles. And so if you can show them that a social protection strategy is not as costly as they fear, and it is in fact more developmental and more inclusive of growth than they expect, they might not become champions, but you change their marginal calculation. When they look at all the battles they need to fight, they realize social protection is not one of them. Social protection is politically popular. It delivers what governments need to deliver in order to build social cohesion by fostering social inclusion. And yes, social protection is also good for employment and economic growth. The finance minister might not buy all of these arguments, but when they compare the various choices they have to make, they may realize that going along with the social cluster on this policy is the right thing to do. And so this economic analysis, even though it should not be driving our decisions about delivering people's rights, about delivering children's rights, it is often a very strategic and pragmatic path to achieving the vital outcomes that are just good in and of themselves.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it reminds me of, I guess, of the very recent visit of the IMF managing director to Uganda, where social protection did come up as one of the paths forward for Uganda, and it's obviously weaved in very much in both an economic and a rights-based argument. I'm wondering, actually, Diego, if you could, when you're reflecting on the way forward for the UNICEF country program and the broader set of development partners in Uganda, can you talk a little bit about the advocacy efforts that you are making, and in particular your relationships with your with non-government actors within Uganda for implementation and fulfillment of the findings of this?
Yeah, no, I'll be happy to say a few words about that. So the investment case really serves as a national platform to engage different stakeholders on different layers of implementation and advocacy. In terms of non-state actors, the nature of our engagement with the non-state actors is largely around advocacy efforts. Advocacy efforts both nationally, but most especially regionally and more disaggregated clusters. So we work with just to illustrate with an example, we work with the National NGO Forum and the Social Protection Platform to engage members of parliament and various sort of stakeholders who sit here with us in Kampala But most importantly, we take this evidence to district planners and people who bottom up might be able to sort of steer up a discussion on the importance of social protection, not just as a national instrument to reduce poverty, but as a local instrument to mobilize the economy, for instance, to alleviate the burden of shocks on poor and vulnerable farmers in remote areas of Uganda. So this is our approach. This is the sort of the heart of our advocacy strategy. And in terms of fostering the development of a more coherent social protection platform, we use the evidence in the investment case to engage different development partners and potential donors to work with us and government in exploring different shapes of contributions of support to Uganda's vulnerable groups, including children who represent close to 70% of the population, vulnerable farmers who represent almost 90% of the economy, and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much. We're getting towards the end of this really interesting session. So I wanted to first say to the participants in the discussion, our sort of audience who've been very active, first, thank you very much. Second of all, I hope that we've answered all your questions, but if not, please do feel free to continue submitting them, and I'm sure we can kind of put together some responses for you. And I think the data is shown on your screen as some areas to submit further comments. In these last 5 minutes, I'd like to hand it over. If I can start with you, Michael, any kind of closing thoughts or takeaways you want to be sure everyone brings home with them today?
Thank you. First, let me thank you for moderating such an excellent webinar, and let me thank Diego and all of UNICEF for the work they've done in supporting this process. This kind of an investment case mechanism is a very important way to address the key questions policymakers have about social protection. It is responsive to the key concerns of policymakers, and that's what good evidence building must do. It's not a supply-driven response. It's not, wow, what do we think is important? Let's do the research we think needs to be done. Yes, that's important, but the real gaps are gaps in answering the questions policymakers have. And as Diego pointed out, that starts with a broad consultation with government where we listen. We listen to the questions they are asking, and we develop our research approach to answer these questions. And Uganda's case, I think, demonstrates these two important results that I've reinforced over the past hour and a half. Social protection for Uganda is affordable. Uganda has the resources and can mobilize the resources to deliver a senior citizens grant, a disability grant, health protection for mothers and young children, and a child support grant. And second, that this investment will not only deliver people's rights, including children's rights, but it is the most powerful investment the country can make in strengthening inclusive social development, including social inclusion, and generating equitable economic growth that can make the country a more prosperous nation. If anybody has questions, I think my email address is on my PowerPoint. I'll be happy to engage by email with any further questions we were unable to answer today. But it's been an honor to be part of this, and thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And then over to you, Diego, to close it up.
Thank you so much, Pam. So my words of wisdom would be make your research relevant, because I mean this is not the end. In fact, this is probably the beginning of a renewed discussion. And my point about making the research relevant is that in many institutions we are very good at doing compartmentalizing things. At UNICEF, we are very good about doing research on child poverty and deprivation, and then we are very good at doing research on social protection, and then we do public finance for children in a different box. But it's we need to get better at linking the three, at using the deprivation analysis to motivate our social protection interventions and research and advocacy strategies, and then use all of that to do some rigorous fiscal space analysis vis-a-vis our social priorities to tie it all together nicely. So that's one thing that we are prioritizing highly in the Uganda office.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you again to everyone who participated in this discussion today. I'd encourage you to read the investment case, which of course expands on a lot of the issues that Michael has discussed today, and is very, very fascinating. So thank you again, and I hope you'll take advantage of his very kind offer to answer questions that are emailed to him as well. And thank you very much again, Michael and Diego as well, for presenting today, and to socialprotection.org for agreeing to host and making this one so smoothly. Thanks again, everyone.